So nearly on the home straight now, it's my pleasure to welcome someone that you probably all know, but I'll introduce him anyway, Hamish Chandler, currently the Program Manager for the Genetics Program in MLA. Hamish had a rocky start to his career. He actually went into the chicken industry for a short period of time, but fortunately he saw the light and got himself back out of that dark place. Got into the beef industry, into beef genetic evaluation, and subsequently into sheep genetic evaluation. So Hamish brings quite a diverse background in terms of genetics and species, and as I'm sure plenty of you know, he also runs a few sheep in his spare time, and he's had everything from Dorpers to superfine Merinos and crossbreds in between. So he's got plenty of practical experience to bring to the genetics discussion. Hamish is going to now give us an update on the resource flock and the future of that program of work. Thanks, Hamish.
Thanks, Richard. I think it's still morning. Morning, everyone. I'd just like to start out by saying thank you so much to the sheep genetics team and the AgBoo team who have pulled everything together. I think they've done a fantastic job. I think there's at least 50 or 60 people more in the room than any of the leading breeder forums that were run while I was directly part of the sheep genetics team. So I think it's a good reason for me just to keep out of people's way. The only criticism is that they've only given me 20 minutes to talk, and the time started when Richard started introducing me, and Nicole has many times told people that I can't say anything in less than half an hour, so we're all in trouble. So I've been asked to talk today about the resource flock of the future, and I'm not going to insult you by going through this slide again. I think by now we're all well aware that we need a reference population for genomic predictions to work. I actually went back to looking how long ago we started talking about this. I pulled this exact slide out of the 2013 leading breeder slide deck. So we've been talking about that one for a very long time. At the same time, Julius has already been kind enough to put this slide together and talk through it, so I don't need to go through it. Obviously, our primary way of collecting reference data up to this point in time has been through the information nucleus flock and more recently the resource flock, and that's ongoing with the newest version of that project. And Julius has already showed this one as well about the impact that has had on accuracy of selection and the improvement that we see as we capture more data. So the main things I just wanted to keep in mind as you're looking at that sort of slide is that there's a number of things that influence our accuracy of prediction that we get from genomics. Heritability of the trait, size and quality of our reference population, and I stress quality, I'll come back onto that later, and the relationship between your animals that you're trying to get genomic predictions for and that reference population. And we need to keep in mind that is on a trait-by-trait basis. So we need a decent-sized reference population for each trait that we're trying to predict. So a couple of wise men that I was having a conversation with once told me, if you need the specifics, it was Julius van der Werf and Rob Banks, so much smarter than me and worthy of listening to, told me the keys to the success with genomic predictions, both in terms of accuracy of prediction, but also uptake, getting people to actually be able to use it. So the success is around not just the accuracy of our prediction, but the cost of getting those genomic predictions. So, I think we've many times talked about the need for our reference population, depending on heritability and what accuracy we're looking for. We need a reference population upwards of 2, preferably 5 or more thousand animals. The genes in the population change over time, so we need an additional 400 or 500 animals at least coming into that reference each year. We need a genetic evaluation that can use both genotypes and phenotypes. We've now got that with single step. That's continuing to evolve. What does that change in terms of how we can utilise reference population data? And cost. I think typically the users, so the breeders, think about the cost of this as being how much am I paying for a genomic test? That's an important part, but what about the cost of the reference population that we need to underpin that as well? So I think we're all happy to see that our genomic predictions, our 15K is coming back down around the $30 mark. If I asked you all to put your hand up if you'd be happy to pay another $90 per test for that genomic prediction, I think a few of you would have a second guess about whether you'd be using too many genomic tests or not. But that's around the sort of magnitude that we're paying right here, right now, to maintain that reference population, to keep our genomic predictions working and keep improving our accuracies. So over time, we definitely need to look at what are our other options for doing this, how do we do it in a more cost-effective way. Now, a very dodgy little diagram, I've got to admit, but just trying to remind myself of some speaking points to say, you know, now that we've got single step in place, we're obviously using the performance that we've recorded on a lamb. We're using, obviously, still the performance that we know on its sire and dam and on other progeny. But at the same time, we're using DNA information. Simultaneously, we've spoken about that a number of times over the last few days. But what does that really mean? When we say we're using DNA information, it really means that we're using the genomic relationship between our animals and animals in the resource flock to say, what was their performance like? How do we use the genomic relationship to predict our breeding values based on those phenotypes in the resource flock? But it's not just the resource flock. Now that we're in single step land, it's also the phenotypes for animals that have been phenotyped and genotyped out in other breeders' flocks as well. So we're already in the situation where that data is coming from a number of different sources. We're using all available information where we can identify genomic relationships between animals. So, you know, we're starting to look at how do we pull data from not just the formal structured resource flock sort of projects, but other studs and potentially commercial animals as well. So I think we need to start thinking about what are our reference population options, what are the pluses and minuses around those different options. So our structured research project sort of way of doing it, our resource flock, or on the cattle side, the repronomics project that Jono was just talking about are our primary examples. Typically, we get really good data quality out of those sort of projects. Excellent data, particularly for our hard to measure and our novel traits that we can't do all that easily any other way. It gives us the opportunity to plan our mating, structured matings, so that we're representing as much of the industry as we can, and we've got good accuracy of prediction widely across the industry. The negative side, well, perception is that on a per animal basis, they're relatively expensive to support. I'll come back to that. We've also obviously got the way that we have to go about funding those. So funding tends to be on a project-by-project basis, so we are a little bit at the mercy of being able to continue getting funding support for those sort of projects. Breeders' flocks. Again, there's a number of advantages of using data from breeders' flocks. There should be a good volume of data that we've got access to, as long as people are starting to genotype as well as phenotype. So I think last year there was something like 25,000 animals genotypes that had data come into us, either through structured projects or from breeders. In comparison, I should have asked Stephen in advance, I'll make myself look like a goose, but I'm guessing we probably received around about 300,000 animals with phenotypes. So we've already got people capturing a bunch of data out there. If we get genotypes on those animals as well, that gives us a heap of data to use, at least for the basic traits. So it's quite often restricted to the traits that we're measuring as routine part of business on farm. So often, you know, hopefully this sort of data is a bit cheaper because people tend to be capturing it as part of as routine business. Data quality is generally reasonable, but can be variable. Something I'll come back to, I guess. Some traits, like our repro traits in sheep, are difficult to collect in those sort of structures. So at the moment, we have been dealing with breeders that we know have got a track record of collecting really good repro traits. We've got evidence of that over the last couple of years, so looking at how do we genotype animals in their flocks to use that information as part of our reference for fertility traits. On the not so positive side for using data out of breeders' flocks, most people aren't really prepared to slaughter animals out of their stud flock to get eating quality traits, for example. So it's not so good for some of the hard to measure. Definitely for the more novel traits that we're doing as part of trial work or experiments to see what's coming up. Data quality really does need to be monitored, and that is why sheep genetics over the last few years has been doing so much work in the data quality grades, ramping up genetic gain reports, that sort of thing. So we can look at what is the quality of information being collected in various places and how do we work with people to make sure that that can be improved. Another issue, I guess, is the proportion of the industry being represented. Obviously, if this was done cross-section across all of our sheep genetics clients, it wouldn't be an issue, but if we're seeing specific studs in particular parts of the industry doing this and not in others, then there might be gaps in what we're being able to represent. The last one, I guess, relates to a question that Peter was asked earlier, how to value those phenotypes if payments are required. And that's a whole other story. I hadn't necessarily been planned on going into today, but we can in the question time if we need to. But the third option, commercial industry data, so abattoir feedback data or whatever it might be. Lots of data out there. As automation comes in, we're collecting large volumes of data, but how much of it can we use? So ideally, data out of commercial supply chain is cheap, at least on a per animal basis. There's large volumes of it, and we can capture it across different points of the supply chain, which is really good news if we can start getting closer to our consumers. But there are some serious challenges with it. Data quality-wise, a lot of that data, we can't account for fixed effects. So we know nothing about date of birth, dam age, or our environmental effects management groups. We can't form very good contemporary groups over time because we don't know how they've been treated along the way. Other things like, again, relationship across the whole of the population. If we're doing it really widely, that might be okay. If we're doing it in specific areas, are we really representing all of the animals in the seed stock sector we're wanting genomic predictions for? There's other issues with the data quality, like are there even number of progeny per sire? Are we seeing other biases or harvesting effects creeping in? So if we're using kill data for lambs, for example, and someone's just turned off the heaviest of their lambs, are they all by 1 or 2 sires? We're not getting even representation. Or if we're looking for fertility data in commercial settings like that, are we really looking at the oldest animals rather than the most fertile if we're capturing preg scan data or something like that in our young ewes? So the other one I think that's really critically important across all of these areas, but particularly in the commercial data, is the coordination and planning. Is how do we go through saying we need data for these particular breeds, for these particular traits, and coordinate out of the hundreds of thousands of bit of data out there, which ones should we be capturing and including in genetic evaluations. So we've got a number of different projects across both beef and sheep in place at the moment that essentially will allow us to test out a lot of these different things. So we all know about the resource flock and some of the bin projects like Repronomics and others in beef cattle, but there's other projects going on like the Northern Beef Genomics project that Ben Hayes from UQ is running, capturing something like genotypes and fertility records on 30,000 Indicus cross heifers in the north of Australia, for example. So as we capture more of that data, look at how we can use it, what sort of heritabilities can we estimate, all that sort of stuff, we'll be better placed to know how well can we use that data for reference population information. So I guess the main concern around some of this is if we can't account for some of those data quality issues, it flows on to lower heritabilities of the traits that we're trying to estimate and that sort of thing. So some work that Julius had done for us at one stage, looking at how many records do we need at different levels of heritability to get the same sort of accuracy of our genomic predictions. So that blue line is if the trait we're measuring is the same as the trait we're trying to predict in our breeding flocks, and reasonably good data, so we've managed to identify a heritability of about 30%. As opposed to the red line, where we're less sure about a whole range of fixed effects and other environmental factors and all that sort of stuff. Still measuring the same trait, but we can only come up with about a 15% heritability. If you look at those two markers, that's saying that to get up to about a 40% accuracy on our genomic prediction, for the data where we've got a higher heritability, we're going to need somewhere around 3,000 records to do that. For the lower heritability trait, so it could well be captured out in commercial industry flocks, for example, we need twice that amount of information. We need 6,000 records to get the same accuracy on our genomic prediction. So I think where we need to start getting to, we know that we should be able to do some of that stuff. Maybe we can, maybe we can't account for a few things that might bias the result, but what's the dollar value of it? What's the real value that we're getting out of that data? So what we've done here is we've just looked at, okay, if we're spending $30 a genotype, it's, say, meat science traits we're wanting to capture. By the time we structure a project, AI use, get lambs through to kill, do all of our meat science measurements through a lab and so on, if we're spending $30 for our genotype, make up a number really, $270 for our phenotyping cost, it's costing us about $900,000 to set up that reference population to get our 40% accuracy on our prediction. If we need 6,000 of them, just work backwards to say, well, we've still got a genotyping cost of $30 an animal. To break even, we need to be able to measure those same traits in those animals for around about $120 an animal. So that's not too far off, I think, where we're at the moment if we want to get those samples and go and put them through a lab somewhere at the moment. So it's probably about break even at this point in time. If we get more automation and we can collect those records a whole lot cheaper, maybe it changes that game for us. But the thing is, we need to start looking at ways, how do we actually look at the relative value of various data capture before we start looking at which projects do we invest in to collect information. If the trait that we're collecting in our commercial setting isn't quite the same as the trait that we're trying to predict, but it's highly correlated, so instead of being the same trait, in this case it's 75% correlated, as well as being lower heritability because there's a bit more noise in the system. Instead of needing 3,000 records like we would in the higher heritability case, or 6,000 like we did if it was the same trait, in this case we need over 11,000 records to get the same accuracy. So using the same sort of logic, I reckon we need to be able to capture that data for about $50 to break even on that investment. So it starts allowing us to look at how do we look at what is the best investment to maintain our resource flock or reference population and maintain our accuracy of prediction. So we can start doing some cost benefit as long as we can develop the appropriate parameters. Commercial data may be cheaper, but we can't assume that it is going to be cheaper or more effective. We need to look at it on a case-by-case basis. So what's this mean for a reference flock or a resource flock, of the future? So those main points still stay the same. In terms of predictive value of the population, it's still down to numbers of animals measured, heritability of the trait, correlation between the trait we're measuring and what we're trying to actually improve, and the relationship between the animals that we're measuring and the animals that we're trying to predict. So I think in reality, the resource flock of the future is most likely going to be a combination of various sources of data, but we're going to have to do some homework on the way through to say, okay, what's most cost effective, what funds do we have available, and then at some stage we still need to come back to the discussions around who should pay for it, and that depends on a lot of things like, is there market failure in paying for these things? I do note that no one put their hand up when I was saying, do you want to pay an extra $90 for your genomic tests? So the thing that I wanted people to take home out of this, so there's several different options that I was talking about, how we can maintain our resource flock or our reference populations. The bit I wanted you to think about is if you're thinking about the structured sort of projects, our resource flock, for example, The main thing that you need to think about is what's the accuracy of prediction going to be like? The more related my animals are to the reference, the better my accuracy of prediction. So if you get an opportunity when that little piece of paper or email or whatever comes out every year saying, do you want to nominate sires for the resource flock? Nominate sires. That's your way of making sure that you've got a good relationship between your animals and the resource flock. Capturing data in breeders' flocks. Any of the animals that you guys are collecting both genotypes and phenotypes on start becoming part of that reference population. So I think the thing I want to stress there is your data quality is more important than ever before. So, it's always been the case where your phenotypes have influenced the accuracy of your breeding values. They've had an influence on the accuracy of any animal that we can identify a pedigree relationship with. Well, now that is also influencing any animal that we can identify a genomic relationship with. So just think about that data quality is more important than ever before. Commercial industry data may well be cheaper per animal, not necessarily better value. And I think over the last 12 months or so, myself and other sheep genetics staff have had conversations with a number of people in the room who are interested in assisting in this way. If you're able to supply high quality data where we can identify fixed effects, we know about the management conditions that they've been run in over time, all that sort of thing, then we're happy to talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hamish. Obviously an important component of maintaining and further developing genomic predictions for current and new traits into the future. A couple of questions. With all the genetics projects on the go, surely the genetics project manager needs a pay rise. Can you send that in, Hamish?
Yeah, and I'm not sure about that. I think she spends too much time on her phone sending text messages.
Right, let's get serious. Should we genotype our sire teams as a minimum each year? What's your opinion on that, Hamish?
There's a couple of ways of doing things that I think as we take over management of the genomics database from the CRC as the CRC winds up, and there's going to be more players in that genotyping space in terms of businesses supplying those services, I think it's going to open up some new and interesting opportunities. We've already got access to parentage and 15K products. We'll have the same higher density products available as well. But I think there's going to be some opportunities where people can look at how do we best utilise products that are most cost effective and think about two-stage selection processes or whatever. Should we be thinking about a whole bunch of parentage tests on some animals, 15K on some animals, and then 50K or whatever on our sires? I think those sort of ways of looking at it are probably going to be really useful. So the ones that we're using most widely and we're wanting our highest accuracy of selection on, I think there is merit in genotyping those animals with a higher density test.
Okay, thanks, Hamish. Now, second question there around the resource flock and reproduction data to help improve reproduction genomic predictions.
So the resource flock isn't going to be collecting reproduction traits on site. The on-site stuff run at Kirby and Katanning and the couple of satellite sites is still going to be slaughter-only traits. But the resource flock project does include a component of working with breeders who have got really good quality data so that we can collect more reproduction data in those businesses and use that to inform our reference population.
So looking just on that same sort of theme, let's go to that middle question, Hamish, with respect to the resource flock, and the question is new health and welfare traits. I'm going to assume you know what that refers to as new traits, or
well, possible traits,
existing traits and potential new traits.
Yeah, so over time there have been some overlay projects looking at immunology type traits, that sort of thing, that we could potentially use as health and welfare traits. It's also been used as overlay for traits like measuring tail length. I know that came up earlier on, I think it was Peter's wish list, So work that's been done on those sites, and Johan, I think, has been involved in quite a bit of that. My understanding is that traits like that, heritability of tail length is about 30%. Work that they've already looked at suggests that you need to look at size of the animal, length of spine as well, so you don't end up breeding for a shorter animal overall. So yes, there are a number of things we're looking at. There is also the potential to do more overlay projects over the top of those sites as things become available.
You gave a strong recommendation, Hamish, that for breeders to nominate sires when the opportunity is available to ensure they have strong linkage to the resource population, the genotype population. So the question there is, for those sires, progeny at home, the value and how many?
I think it's important to differentiate between genetic linkage that we look at in the traditional sense of linkage for using phenotypes from using information for genomic predictions. So there's, I think for terminal sires, 15 doses get used in the resource flock. For merinos and so on, 18 doses. That's not a massive amount of progeny that are going to end up on the ground for linkage in your traditional sense. So you still need to be looking at what AI size or what other outside size you're using in your flock to drive genetic linkage, so phenotypes are used effectively. The resource flock is really about what genes are we identifying and how do we use those genes for genomic predictions. So I'd sort of separate those two things a little bit. I wouldn't rely on putting a ram in the resource flock to drive genetic linkage for your business. Yes, it will contribute to some degree, but there's not going to be all that many progeny in the resource flock to help drive that. I'd still look at them as two separate things.
And just on that, so continuing in the resource flock there, the dams used in the resource flock, what's known about them, Hamish?
The dams in the resource flock end up getting used in the resource flock a number of times. So you build a profile, I guess, over a couple of different lambings. Other than that, I think Julius's strategy, I think, is really about making sure that we turn them over fairly routinely, so you're not having them in the flock for more than 3 lambings, so that we're actually spreading the haplotypes that we're collecting across as many different ewes as possible.
The MLP flock, what's its potential to be used to contribute to the resource population for the merino industry?
Definitely, it will be very useful information. It's data that's captured a whole bunch of phenotypes on animals in a very structured way and has got genotypes on them as well. So yes, it's valuable information, especially seeing we're not capturing wool data in the resource flock.
And just one last quick one to wrap up. We'll take that middle one, Hamish. Just a really simple question there about where do breeders go to know which sires are being used in the resource flock?
Yeah, okay. So on the Sheep Genetics website, there is a flag that you can select to say whether it has been used in the resource flock. So you can get reports of breeding values for sires that have been used in that context. We're also looking at developing a bit better report at the moment to send out to people who've participated about what sires have been submitted over time in addition to that.
Okay, we'll give you the lucky last one there, Hamish, in terms of that commercial data, and it's the comments that it's relatively cheaper to collect. Would the resource flock program be looking to fund that if it proved to be appropriate data?
If it's appropriate data, we'd obviously look at those funding sources. So it depends, I guess, the resource flock budget is reasonably well defined. If there are, everyone's smiling, I'm guessing Jones has put something else up on the... distracted me completely. I can't even remember what I was saying now.
I think the answer was yes, the resource flock would
so
look at the funding of some of that commercial data.
Depends on the value of the data. We'll obviously look at that. The other option is National Livestock Genetics Consortium does go out with a call on a reasonably regular basis looking for genetics projects. Our budget is committed at this point in time, but once we get through some of the existing projects, then we will be looking for additional project calls as well, and some of that reference data could well apply to that.
Very good. Thank you,
Look,
Hamish.
I really need to address that. Look, I'd love to, Daniel, but we still need to resolve the eyebrow issue.
And I think the more appropriate question, actually, Hamish, would be as to your potential to shave to contribute to fundraising to give Daniel some moral support.
Yeah, okay, right. We'll discuss that in more detail.
That'll be a good conversation in the car on the way home. Okay, join me in thanking Hamish. Thank you.